Good day, grade 12 learners. I hope you are all doing well and you're geared up for this lesson, which is meant to help you succeed in your matric. Today's lesson is a history lesson, and remember, we are bridging the gap. So the title of this lesson is The Cold War. We're focusing on the origins of the Cold War. So, when you look at the curriculum scope of the Cold War, even though we're only focusing on the origins of the Cold War, please bear in mind that there are subtopics that are part of the Cold War that you have to know very, very well. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. I'm not going to go over all of them, but you know that you have to know things like why did the Cold War develop? You need to know the United States policy of containment, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, and then you have to know the Berlin Crisis. You have to know the containment and brinkmanship, Cuban Missile Crisis. The reason I'm telling you this is because in terms of the exam, the examiners can choose to focus on any of these subtopics. So the reason is, please do not just focus on what I will be doing today. Remember, today, the aim of the lesson is to help you to deal with exam techniques. But in terms of studying, please make sure that you have covered all this content that is shown on the curriculum scope. That is very important. So, we'll be focusing on historical concepts like what was the Cold War, what is brinkmanship, defining words in your own terms, interpreting sources and their limitations, and how to extract relevant information from the sources. Those are all the skills that will help you succeed in your exams. Now, the objectives of today's lessons are how to analyze sources. That is very, very important, historians, because what is history without analyzing sources? And then the next thing is how to apply knowledge to interpret the information in the sources, because you will see that the questions that you will be asked in the exam situation will expect you to analyze the sources. That is how you will be able to answer the questions. How to extract relevant information from the sources. You will see that some of the questions will require you to just extract information from the sources. And then, as I said before, when we looked at the skills, it is important to know how to evaluate usefulness and limitation of the sources. Now remember, there are key words that you have to know in terms of the Cold War. Those are the concepts that go with the Cold War. Again, I'm not going to go over all of them. You already know them because you will have studied this section. They're very, very important. And also there is essential skills and information that you should have before you study the Cold War. That is the information that you will have studied in the previous grades, from grade 8, 9, 10, and 11. Things like World War I, World War II, capitalism in the United States, communism in the USSR, all those are going to help you understand the Cold War better. Now, remember I said this is bridging the gap. We are trying to help you improve. So, it's very important that you're able to see cause and effect in history. You are able to explain historical terms and concepts in your own words. And you are able to identify limitations of the sources. In terms of exam writing competences, because remember, this is not just about history, but it's also about answering exam questions and how to be successful. So what happens is you have to know how to read questions. You have to obviously portray critical thinking skills, manage your time properly, and then the other things that I'm going to tell you as we go on with our lesson. I hope you all understand what today's lesson is about, and I hope you will enjoy it. So we are going to go for a quick commercial break, and after break, I will see you where we'll look at specific questions to help you apply these skills. Welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed your break. As I said before, this is History Bridging the Gap. Now, we've looked at our objectives for the lesson. Now let's look at the skills and how to apply them. So the first thing we're going to look at is defining historical concepts. Remember, I told you before the break that there are specific concepts that are related to the Cold War that you have to know from studying. Okay? And then when it comes to the exam, you have to be able to recognize and explain those concepts. So if you look at the problem that most learners experience in an exam situation is that there is lack of comprehension of these historical concepts. And the reason why this is problematic is because later on you will be asked to define these concepts in your own words. So if you cannot comprehend, okay, so I'm underlining this word because it means understanding. If you understand the concept, that means you will be able to explain it in your own words, and also it will help you understand the source later on when you read it and look at cause and effect and other things you have to do with the sources. So it's very, very important to understand your historical concepts, and that will come from the studying as well. So remember, before the break, I told you the specific concepts that are related to the Cold War that you have to know. Things like, what was the Cold War? What was the Yalta and Potsdam conferences? The concept of Iron Curtain. Are you able to define all those words in your own terms? There are lots of those historical concepts. I'm not going to go over all of them because I have given them to you there. As I said, it is important that you really know them. And then I also told you that the importance of knowing these historical concepts is because you will be expected to define them in your own words. So in other words, even if the source has given you a definition, what the examiners would like to see from you is whether you are able to define these in your own words. Because if you can do that, then it shows that you have an understanding of what those concepts mean. That is very important in history. Okay, I've already told you that the skills problem is the lack of comprehension of those terms and interpretation of sources. Because if you do not comprehend the terms or the historical concepts, that means you will not be able to interpret sources. And remember in history that we have different types of questions. So if you don't understand the historical terms and you cannot interpret the sources, that means you cannot be able to answer other higher level or higher order thinking questions. So this is the starting point for you, grade 12 learners, is that you understand these historical concepts and you are able to then interpret the source and define these terms in your own words. So I've given you examples here, like there is an understanding of what the Cold War is. The textbook will give you a definition of the Cold War, but then how can you define it in your own words? Like you can say it was an ideological conflict between communism and capitalism, or, there are different ways of saying this. You don't have to say it the same way all the time. You could even say it was conflict between the USA and the USSR based on differences in ideologies. So you will see all of them here that they are in your own words. Now, let's look at an example from a past paper to help you understand how to apply this skill in an exam situation. So this is a question from paper 1, 2023. It says, define the term blockade in your own words. Okay, I keep going back to that because if you don't define it in your own words and you use the words that are in the source, you will lose the marks. Okay, now the source below is an extract from the Berlin Crisis. That is what you will be given in the source booklet. Okay, and The caption reads, it's a report on the Moscow Discussions 1948 by the U.S. Department of State, delivered to the representatives of the USSR in Washington, London, Paris on July 1948. It indicates the US's reaction to the Berlin blockade. So you will have studied the Berlin blockade. Now you have to define it in your own words. Now this is the expected solution or answer to the problem. Okay, it could mean sealing or closing off a place to prevent goods. Okay, so sealing off or closing of a place to prevent goods or people from entering or leaving. So that shows understanding of the concept of blockade. It could also mean preventing freedom of movement. So those words, freedom of movement, are very important, from one place to another, or placing obstacles to hinder one's path. So you can see that if they've given you these different choices, they are saying that any relevant answer to this question, but it has to be relevant and it has to show your understanding of the term blockade. That is very important. Okay, another example is define the concept containment. Now remember, Cold War is about containment, and you must also bear in mind that this has to be in your own words. Okay, so you will get another source with a caption. So the word will be used in the caption itself, or it can be used in the actual source. But then in your answer, you have to show the examiners and the markers that you know the meaning of containment. If you look at the skills, it's identifying command words in your own words. Okay, so remember, you are defining. You do not need to explain, you do not need to discuss, just define the word containment in your own words. That is very important. So if you look at this solution here, because there is a caption that says the Truman Doctrine was based on the principle of containing, so there is the word containing communism where it already existed and not allowing it to spread to neighboring European nations like an unstoppable virus. Now, if you look at the solution there, these are the possible answers that you could give, remember, in your own words, as I said before. Please make sure that you do not repeat the words of the question. You need to show understanding. That comprehension that I spoke about, very, very important. Make sure that you are doing this in your own words. So let's look at the possible answers here. A U.S. foreign policy adopted after the Second World War to contain or restrict the further spread or expansion of communism. Another possible answer is a policy of preventing, so that word preventing is very important, the expansion or spread of a hostile ideology or ideas. I hope that helps you understand how to define concepts in your own words and not to just repeat the sources, because as I said to you, if you just repeat the source, you are not showing understanding. It's very, very important to show the reader or the marker that you understand these concepts and you are able to define them in your own words, because if you can define them in your own words, that means you'll be able to interpret the sources. Let's go to another ad break, and then when we come back, we will carry on with other skills. Welcome back. We are still doing our history lesson, looking at the origins of the Cold War. Now let's look at the other skills that you will be expected to apply when you're answering questions in the exam. So if you look at this one, skills problem is learners often struggle with interpretation of the sources. There is also another problem, which is lack of understanding of cause and effect. Now, that concept of cause and effect in history is very important because what it tells you is this is what happened and this is what it led to. So hopefully these examples that I'm going to be using, or the examples that I'm going to show you, will help you understand how to apply those skills and show the markers and the examiners that you do understand that this is what happened in history and this was the result. So if I've given you guidelines on how to interpret sources. These guidelines are very, very important. Please make sure that you remember them. The first thing is you have to read the caption of the source in order to understand the context. So what often happens in questions is they ask you about the origin of the source. You need to know who wrote the source, when was it written. So it's the author, the date, where was it written, and then the description of the source. The description of the source is very important because it tells you if it's a cartoon, if it's a photograph, or if it's a diary entry. All those things will help you understand why a source is useful or it is limited, or why people say things they say. Who are they? Which ideology or school of thought do they subscribe to? Because someone who's a communist is not going to say what a capitalist is going to say. So that is very important. And then the next thing you need to do is underline or highlight, do whatever you're comfortable with, the key events. So I'm going to circle that, key events or actions, because that is also going to help you understand cause and effect. If you can see that this was a key action, then you need to ask yourself, what did it lead to? What was the result, or what was the next action after that key action? You also need to highlight the key role players and their actions. So historical figures are very important because they are the ones that drive the narrative. They are driving the history, the story. So you need to know, in terms of the Cold War, Truman, Stalin, you need to know Marshall, for Marshall Plan, what did they do? So what were their actions? That is how you interpret the sources. Khrushchev, if you're doing the Cuban Missile Crisis, very, very important. Fidel Castro, all those historical figures are very important. They will help you understand what happened and why things happened the way they did. Look for the reactions or consequences, as I've already said. And then, if you're given a visual source, okay, you look for visual clues. I'm going to underline visual clues there. If it's a photograph, what does the photograph show to explain the event that took place? That will help you understand and interpret sources properly. I hope those guidelines will help you to deconstruct your questions. So now let's quickly look at the examples from past papers to help you understand how to now apply those skills. The first example says you need to comment. Remember again, it's very important to read your questions and do exactly what you're being asked to do. Comment on the implications of having the city of Berlin in the Soviet zone in the context of the Cold War. This has to be in the context of the Cold War. Tensions between the USSR and the USA. So if you read the caption, it says, the city of Berlin, 110 miles inside the eastern zone of Berlin, of the Soviets, became a special area for joint four-power control. Before the Soviet army officially took control of its zone, there was a last-minute rush of people from east to west. They feared that the Russians would establish a more secure border, one that would be impossible to get through. So you need to comment on the implications of that, of having the city of Berlin situated on the Soviet zone. Okay, what would be the cause and effect? What would be the result of having that? Okay, so if you look at the solution there, it says the city of Berlin will become a pawn that the Soviet Union would use. Very important, because then it shows effect. Okay, to settle their differences with the Western powers. The city of Berlin will become isolated from the Western powers, because you will remember that Berlin was divided into East and West. Okay, Western powers were concerned that decisions taken for the city of Berlin might be dominated by the Soviet Union. because Berlin was situated on their zone. So those are the possible responses that you will have to give. Another example is, explain why you think the occupying countries, okay, I'm going to underline the occupying countries. You have to know those from studying. Which countries occupied Germany and Berlin after the war? That is very important. So explain why you think the occupying countries had to ensure that the Germans were not able to build up a military force again. So this is straight from the source. It's in inverted commas. It says, had to ensure that the Germans were not able to build up a military force again. So you get given a caption again and the actual source. It says, the Allies agreed on a border in the west. A temporary line for the east was to be the Oder and Western Nesse rivers. Each occupying country had to ensure that the Germans were not able to build up a military force again. So now you are asked to explain why you think these countries wanted to ensure that the Germans were not able to build up that military force. Now, these are the possible answers to the question. To prevent Germany, that word prevent is very important, from attacking its neighbors in future, or to prevent the expansion in Eastern Europe. Germany was blamed for having caused the Second World War, so she had to be weakened. Germany brought economic misery to the whole of Europe, or the aim was to maintain peace in Europe. Okay, so remember to underline the key words. Remember to identify the command words in the question. What are you being asked to do? That is very, very important. Now let's look at the limitations of sources. This is in line with interpreting the sources. As I said to you, you look at the caption. It will tell you who the author was, when was the source written, why it was written, who published it, and then look at the actual content. What does the source say? That will help you understand and interpret the source. Let's quickly look at our example to determine the limitation of the sources. The question says, comment on the limitations of the source for an historian researching the division of Berlin. And also remember to look at the mark allocation. If it's 2 times 2 and it's 4 marks, that means you're expected to give 2 points there. Sometimes they will tell you to give 2 points, but oftentimes you have to watch the mark allocation. So I'm not going to read the caption. It's right there, and it tells you what the source is about, and that is the information that will help you answer the question. And remember, the focus is the limitations of the source. Remember, I told you how to look for limitations. Look at the author, look at the date, look at the content and all that. So if you look at the possible solution to that question on limitation, it says the source only portrays the Soviet command's viewpoint, therefore it is one-sided. Another possible response is the source is critical of, or it is biased to financial reforms in Western-controlled zones. Now let's look at another skill that is very important when answering questions. That is extracting relevant information and evidence from the sources. Now the problem here is comprehension of sources and difficulty in extracting relevant information from the sources. Now these are the guidelines on how to extract relevant information. You have to highlight the keywords. That's very important. Read the caption to understand the context. You need to underline the key events and people. Read the glossary of terms to understand their meaning. And also, please make sure you do not use own knowledge here, because the skill is to extract information from the source. So let's look at the example. Identify in the source the 3 countries, so I'm going to underline identify, the 3 countries that made up the European Advisory Commission. And you can see the mark allocation is 3 times 1 equals 3. On 17th July 1945, Truman, I'm going to underline Truman, Churchill and Stalin met at Potsdam near Berlin. It was at this meeting that the final decisions were made regarding how Germany should be organized and where its borders would be. So you can see here, they've given you the names of the leaders. So from the names of the leaders, you have to identify the three countries. The solution is, it was the United States or the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union. So you can see those are linked to the leaders that are given in the caption. Another example is why, according to the source. So you can see here it says according to the source. That tells you that you cannot use your own knowledge. It's according to the source. Why was it decided at Yalta in February 1945 to also create a zone for France in Germany? So it's 1 times 1 equals 1 mark, so you just need 1 point there. And the caption reads, later at conference held in February 1945 at Yalta, the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill were able to convince Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, to create a zone for France, which had suffered 3 invasions and 2 defeats at the hands of Germany within 70 years. So the solution there is, it's a straight extraction from the source. Roosevelt and Churchill were able to convince Stalin to create a zone for France, which had suffered 3 invasions and 2 defeats at the hands of Germany within 70 years. I hope that has helped you understand how to apply your skills to answering exam questions and to help you succeed. Explain why you think the USA regarded the Berlin blockade as a clear violation of existing agreements concerning the administration of Berlin. Very, very important to identify the command words. So you can see there, the word is explain, and then the examiners have taken a quotation from the source as it is. Now you have to explain why you think the United States regarded the Berlin blockade as that. Now, if you look at the source, it says, this consideration, so this was a consideration, together with responsibility for the physical well-being of the population of its sector of Berlin, including hundreds of thousands of women and children, obliged the United States to insist, very important there, that in accordance with existing agreements, the arrangements for the movement of freight and passengers, traffic between the western zones and Berlin be fully restored. Very important. So don't forget to underline the important words. Now, let's look at the possible response to this question. The USA saw the Berlin blockade by the Soviet Union as a deliberate act of bringing poverty to Berliners. Another possible response is the USA saw the blockade as a decision, very important to highlight, decision that the Soviet Union took without discussing with other countries. The USA saw the Berlin blockade as a threat to their administration of its zone. Now, let's move on to another example that will help you understand how to answer exam questions. This one says, what do you think, okay, what do you think Truman meant by the statement? So now the statement is directly from the source and it reads, the seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. That is what Truman said. So what do you think Truman meant by this statement regarding the spread of communism to Europe? You can see the mark allocation there. It's 2 marks, which means you just provide an explanation of what you think Truman meant by this statement. And remember, just because the question says, what do you think, it doesn't mean anything goes. The question tells you that you need to think your answer with regard to the spreading of communism to Europe, and then you link the statement to that. So if you look at the source, it says, the seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured, which means supported, by misery and want. They spread and grow, very important words, in the evil soil of poverty and strife or conflict. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. So that statement is in the context of the source itself that is given. So don't forget to underline the keywords in the question, to look for supporting evidence in the source to explain what Truman meant by that statement. Now, let's quickly look at a possible solution or response to that question. So it meant that, or Truman meant that, totalitarian regimes which are communist, very important, because in the question it did say regarding the spread of communism. So you have to mention that. Totalitarian regimes which are communist would thrive, it does say that in the source, where there is lack of basic resources. They would flourish in poor and needy countries. Or you could say totalitarian regimes which are communist, so you can see again here the word which are communist is repeated there because it's very important to be in line with the spread of communism, would most likely gain popularity. So that means they would gain that support. Remember, the word support was in the source. In the European countries with weak economies as a result of the Second World War. Or another possible response that you could give there is European governments would turn to dictatorship. So that word dictatorship is also very important because it tells you that the Soviet Union was going to install dictatorship, which are communists. So you can see again for the third time the word which are communists is included there because that was in the question itself. When they fail to meet the needs of their communities. Another thing that is repeated in all these possible responses is about the needs of the communities. You can see there the weak economies as a result of the Second World War is included there, and also in the first option that you can give, it says in poor and needy countries. So that shows that you know the context of what happened after the Second World War and also the possibility of communism spreading in that context. Therefore, that is what Truman meant by that statement. So again, you can see that while you're interpreting these sources, you're also applying your cause and effect skills. I hope that makes a lot of sense to you. So we are now going to go for a very short commercial break while you think about these questions and maybe look back at the examples that I've given you to understand what is going on. And when we come back, I'll give you more examples to help you succeed in your exam and show you how you can apply these very important historical skills. Welcome back. Let's look at more practice questions to help you with your historical skills and exam technique. So the next question reads, quote 2 reasons. So I'm underlining the word quote because that's very important, and please make sure that you follow instructions. It says 2 reasons. Okay, it's reasons, not events, not causes, not results, but reasons from the source. Not from your own knowledge. Okay, remember when you're quoting, you're taking the words exactly as they are from the source. Why the United States of America could not falter or fail in supporting the free peoples of the world. So again, you look at the mark allocation there. That means 2 times 1 equals 2. It means you give 1 quote. Please make sure that you do not give more because you'll be wasting your time and also you will not be answering the question. So, the source reads, the free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining, so you can already see, in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter or fail in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world and we shall surely endanger the welfare of our own nation. So now, if you underline and highlight those, your job is made easy because then the quote is already there for you. Now, let's look at the solution. So this is extraction of evidence from the source. Remember that the source does say, we may endanger the peace of the world. We shall surely endanger the welfare of our nation. It's a direct quote from the source. Let's look at another example that will help you succeed in your exams. Explain what is implied by the statement. So you're explaining, okay, and they give you a statement from the source. The statement is, Truman decided it was time for the United States to step into the role of world leader. That is very important. So what did he mean by that? In the context of the Truman Doctrine. So this requires prior knowledge, your previous knowledge of what the Truman Doctrine was about and why it was implemented, and then you need to explain what was implied by what he said. So this is what is contained in the source. While not an entirely new idea, it was never seriously envisioned or intended as a foreign policy until March of 1947, after a presidential address to Congress by Truman. Due to their own domestic hardships, okay, now I'm going to underline that, it's very important because it explains why the Truman Doctrine came about. England announced that they would be unable to continue to militarily and economically support the democratic and strategically located nations of Greece and Turkey. Truman decided it was time for the United States to step into the role of the world leader. Now you can see this is the direct quote that is in the source. A role left vacant by the declining British Empire. So I'm going to circle this declining British Empire because it is linked to the fact that England announced that they would be unable to continue to militarily and economically support their democratic and strategically located nations. So you can see there. So your explanation is going to come from that source. These are the possible responses. The Truman Doctrine formalized the replacement, so you can see replacement of England with the United States as a defender of capitalism against communism. The United States had to stand up and challenge the Soviet Union that had emerged after the Second World War as a threat to democracy in the world. The United States had to ascertain that its economic policy of capitalism flourished in the whole world by supporting the government against the popularity of the communist leaders. The United States had to provide military support to governments that were threatened with the protests due to the shortage of resources. So that shortage of resources is also important after the war. The United States had to provide advice and skills to weak governments. So you can see those are all the reasons why it was important to implement the Truman Doctrine in order to strengthen their leadership against communism. So all these responses show that the Truman Doctrine was put in place because there was a problem, but also to stop the spread of communism, as you can see. Now let's look at another example, which is an interesting one, and this one is a cartoon. It says, comment on the limitations of this source. So limitations of the source for a historian researching communism. This is a cartoon now, it's a visual source. So in terms of history, you can be asked limitations questions on textual sources or visual sources. So the caption of this cartoon is, the cartoon is by Mark Hill, a USA cartoonist. So that is very important. You need to know where it comes from. And it depicts President Truman of the United States of America supporting Europe financially and militarily against a threat posed by the virus of communism. So the word virus there is very important, and it is in the cartoon itself. It says virus of communism. So now comment on the limitation of this cartoon. So looking at the possible solutions, the first one is the author is an American. So that was in the caption. That is a limitation. So he is an American who might be against communism, therefore shows bias against the Soviet Union. Another possible response you can give there is that the source portrays the ideology of communism negatively or in a bad light as a virus. It's already there in the source. I circled it in the cartoon. It shows communism as a virus. Another possible response is the source portrays the Truman Doctrine as a solution. Solution is very important, while communism is depicted as a problem. So that is a limitation, and also that shows bias. The source portrays the United States as a savior. I'm going to highlight savior of Europe, and does not expose its real imperialist intentions. So again, that speaks to the United States being shown in a positive light and the Soviet Union being shown in a negative light. You don't necessarily have to pick on the visual clues of the cartoon with this one, but you can, just to make your answer or your response stronger, like using the words virus of communism, but as long as your comment is in line with what is shown in the source. I hope that has helped you understand how to analyze sources in history, and more importantly, how to answer exam questions so that you can do very, very well. And I'm sure you will all do well in the next exam. Let's go for a very short ad break, and when we come back, we're going to recap on what the lesson was about and the important things that you need to remember when you're preparing for your exams. Welcome back. I hope you have enjoyed today's history lesson and you are going to do very well in your exams and make us all proud. Now, let's quickly wrap up and look at what we've done since the beginning of our history revision lessons to help you improve your results. Remember, when we started, I told you about the scope of history, that you have to know the different subtopics that are part of the origins of the Cold War, like knowing the policy of containment, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, the brinkmanship, Cuban Missile Crisis, and so on. Make sure that you have studied your work. That is very, very important. We also looked at the skills that are very important in order to succeed in history. Like we looked at historical concepts, why they are important, and also why you have to define them in your own words. We looked at how to interpret the sources and their limitations and the usefulness of the sources. And we also looked at how to extract relevant information and evidence from the sources. And when you're asked to quote, quote, and not use your own knowledge. In terms of historical terms, very, very important that you study them, you know what they are and what they mean, so that you can be able to analyze them and define them in your own words. So we looked at all those terms right up to brinkmanship. And then in terms of the common errors that young learners often make, they often struggle to see cause and effect. So I hope from the examples that I gave you, you were able to see how we look at cause and effect in history. Interpret the sources. We also looked at different examples showing us how to interpret sources and also look at cause and effect and look at who the author is and so on. Explain historical terms in your own words. Please make sure again that you do not repeat what is in the source. Everything has to be in your own words if you're asked to do that. And identifying the limitation of the sources. We even gave you guidelines of what you need to do. Look at who the author is, the date, when the source was written, why it was written, and that will tell you whether it is limited or not. And remember, the flip side of that is the usefulness of the sources. If the source is useful, it's because of who the author is, when it was written, and then the content that is contained in that source or the information. Very important. And then, coupled with that, so while you hone in on your historical skills, you have to remember there are exam techniques as well, like your reading, your critical thinking, time management, interpreting sources, comprehending them, communicating, because when you're writing, you're communicating. Those are all very, very important. And just as a bonus, okay, I've given you further exam questions that you can use in your own time at home to practice all the skills that I've shown you today, and you can look at those from paper 1, November 2022, and there are different questions that were specifically chosen for you, targeting different skills. I hope you will all do well and make us all proud. Thank you very much, and goodbye.